I'm Yash Kanoria. I'm at Columbia, one of the organizers. And we are very excited to have with us today Juliet Schor. She's going to be telling us, she's going to be sharing some of her expertise on the gig economy with us. So let me quickly introduce Julie. So Juliet Schor is an economist and sociologist at Boston College. Schor's research focuses on the sociology of work, consumption, and climate change. A graduate of Wesleyan University, Schor received her PhD in economics at the University of Massachusetts. Before joining Boston College, she taught at Harvard University for 17 years in the Department of Economics and the Committee on Degrees in Women's Studies. Schor's most recent book is After the Gig: How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked and How to Win It Back. University of California Press 2020. And in fact, she has her book launch coming up on September 1st. Previous books include The Overworked American, The Overspent American, and Plenitude: The New Economics of True Wealth. Her current research topics include the gig economy and the future of work, time use, and the drivers of carbon emissions. She is currently working on an NSF funded project on the algorithmic workplace. Schor is also the chair of the board of directors of Better Future Project, a Massachusetts based climate activist organization. Thank you, Julie, for joining us. And we are also joined by guest Professor Lindsay Cameron from Wharton. So thank you very much, Lindsay, for joining us. Would you like to say hello? Okay, so I guess Lindsay is currently muted, but when she wants to share something, she will unmute herself. So, Julie, the floor is yours.
Great. So thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to talk today about some work which is more sociological in nature. It is based on the work that we've been doing studying gig workers. So let me just get started because I know we just have an hour. So the focus of the talk today is to think about heterogeneity among platform workers. And this is one of the big findings that we've had in our research. So the paper, the work that I'm going to talk about today comes from a paper that just came out online called Dependence and Precarity in the Platform Economy, as well as my book. And a third paper I'll talk a little bit about at the end on what we might call diverse sort of models of economic action, or behavioral models, to use the economist term. So, as you know, I think there's been a lot of unrest in the gig economy. We were just talking about the conflicts in California. Uber is, or Lyft announced today that it's shutting down at midnight in California rather than make its drivers employees. There was the first global strike of ride-hail drivers last May. And Instacart workers have also gone on strike, Whole Foods workers, a lot of app-based workers have been expressing dissatisfaction about their conditions of work and what's going on. So the work that I'm going to present comes from two projects. Primarily this first project, its title was Connected Consumption and Connected Economy. It began in 2011, ended in 2018. It was wholly within sociology. So these are the sociology grad students of mine who worked on the project with me. And more recently, I've started an interdisciplinary project with engineers, sociologists, and one law faculty folks at Northeastern. And we're doing a 10-platform study with interviews, survey data. We're also doing agent-based modeling and analysis, big data analysis, focusing on algorithms and human interactions with the algorithms. So I want to start by asking the question, what do platforms do? A lot of the discussion, particularly in in sociology, geography, I would say, in the press, has been a pretty normative discussion. And there's been a lot of controversy about these platforms, particularly as it with respect to their treatment of labor, which is what I'm going to focus on today. But if we move beyond are they good or bad employers, to think more analytically about what is different about labor relations on sharing or gig labor platforms. And the answer, I think, the answer that I want to give today is, first of all, that platforms represent a new way to manage labor. We came to that from studying a number of different platforms, and that is one of the differences in the work that I've done in comparison to a lot of the social science work, which is sort of single platform studies or single sector studies. And that's part of how we came to think differently, I think. So I just want to mention that in 2011, when we started looking at these new kind of entities, we started with nonprofits, only some of which were sort of app-based or very algorithmic. And in fact, some of them weren't algorithmic at all, but within the nonprofit world, there's actually a range from the sort of highly algorithmatized to the lower. But we studied a time bank, which is a multilateral barter service, a food swap, and a makerspace. And you can see here the references to popular culture in our makerspace. And then we moved on to for-profit platforms: Airbnb, TaskRabbit, which is an errands platform; Turo, which is an Airbnb for cars, a peer-to-peer car rental; to mostly food delivery, but couriers, Postmates and Favor platforms; Uber and Lyft. And the last platform that we studied was called Stocksy United, one of the first and largest of what's called a platform cooperative, where the workers, in this case, the artists, the photographers, actually owned and governed the platform. And I'd be happy, I'm not going to talk about that one today, but in the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk about it. It's a really interesting case. So with the Northeastern study, we've gone, since the interviewing started post-COVID, we've been focusing on Instacart, Prime Now shoppers, and flex deliverers and drivers. So basically the food delivery service, and we're going to be adding, starting in September, adding a number of other platforms. Just before I get into the findings on these papers, to give you a sense of the different topics that we've worked on. As I said, we started with these nonprofit sharing and looked at their viability. We've looked at how participants in this sector feel about what they're doing, kind of the moral aspirations of many people in the quote unquote sharing economy. We've looked at Airbnb hosting. We have a big database of Airbnb listings and have done a number of studies looking mostly at racial discrimination, gentrification, how the reputation systems are working. We're now moving out to study the efficacy of Airbnb regulations and also greenhouse gas emissions associated with Airbnb. We're looking at issues of inequality on the platforms, vulnerability in ride hail for the drivers, systems of labor control, and as I said, these platform co-ops. So we have papers on almost all of these. So what do platforms do? In a recent review that I did with my colleague Steve Vallis, we identified 4 major approaches in the literature about answering that question, what do platforms do? So the first one is probably one you're very familiar with. I won't spend much time on it. It comes mostly out of economics and management to a lesser extent, and maybe even the engineering perspective as well, which focuses on the sort of efficiencies associated with the algorithms and with crowdsourced information. So reduced management costs, enhanced efficiency in logistics, lower search costs, the ability of these kinds of technologies to foster self-employment and entrepreneurialism, the cheapness of information and sort of overcoming information deficits associated with peer-to-peer exchange and efficient payment systems. So this approach tends not to have a critical dimension to it. It predicts more self-employment, reduced scale of, enterprises as people can start small businesses and use platforms for that. And also to get lower prices because of the efficiencies that you get in the logistics and the management. The second approach is also very oriented to the algorithms, but it kind of flips the script in the sense that it's a critical view of algorithms. And it says algorithms are now able to control all aspects of the labor process. So it's the idea of the algorithmic manager or algorithmic control. It focuses, some of these accounts focus on asymmetric information between what the worker has and what the platform has. And because the platform has more information, that creates power over the workers. It focuses on the lack of human contact, on arbitrary decision-making by algorithms, a kind of informational panopticon in which the algorithm is sucking up huge amounts of data from workers and so forth. And it's a very kind of negative approach to what algorithms are doing in the workplace in this gig labor space. The third approach is also pretty negative and critical, and it focuses not so much on the technology, but on the social relations of production, we could say, and the sort of shift from secure employment to independent contracting and the growth of what sociologists call precarity. So the idea of the risk shift from firms bearing a lot of risk to putting all the risk onto workers. Now, this is something that has been going on in the US economy for a long time. David Weil talks about the fissured workplace, Guy Standing's idea of the precariat. So a lot of work has been done on the sort of growing insecurity associated with employment and the sort of the shift of workers having to bear more and more risk. And there's also a kind of neoliberal dimension to that, which is the state doing less to absorb risk in recent decades. And for this approach, that's really what it's all about. The legal issue of employee status is really very key to understanding this approach. And the technology doesn't really play much of a role at all. A fourth smaller group of literature thinks about platforms as what we might call institutional chameleons, which basically says, you know, there's really nothing special about the platforms. It all depends on where they're deployed. So in Europe, the platforms are very different than the way they are used in the United States. The fact that European states are regulating platforms means the worker experience is very different. So the platform itself is pretty malleable, and it's really the policy environment that matters. And some of these are political scientists who are making these arguments. So I take a different approach and argue that we need to think of platforms as a kind of hybrid. There's obviously, every one of these literatures has some insights, really important insights, but they all have sort of shortcomings, I would say. So what I have argued is a key thing that's really important with the platforms is that they have engineered, or what they are doing is what I've called a retreat from control, in the sense that they don't control things that most employers control. Very importantly, hours of work, scheduling, and the labor process itself in many of these contexts. Also, the platforms are open access, meaning almost anybody can join. There are a few disqualifying conditions, most importantly having to do with criminal history. But for the most part, they're open access. So they don't stop people from joining if there isn't enough work for the people who are on them and so forth. And one of the things this does is it yields a very heterogeneous labor force along many different dimensions. So how do these firms control the workers? I mean, if you look in the social science literature on production, one of the things you'll find is that it's whenever you can't have, from economist point of view, whenever you can't have perfectly complete contracts, you're going to have issues around labor control. And what we argue is that the technology obviously is doing some dimension of the control, and in this, the algorithmic control folks are right, but they've overstated what the what the algorithms are doing. And the market is in fact creating a lot of discipline for these firms. And I'm going to show you why I think that's true. And to do that, we use a concept that we developed, which we call platform dependence or independence. And that is how dependent the worker is on the platform to pay their basic expenses. And this turns out in our data to be really important in understanding the worker's experience and also the controllability of the worker. I'm also going to just at the end say a few things about another paper which argues that people act really differently. We have these very different models of behavior. So the last thing I want to say here is to just say, and I made this point earlier about a multi-platform study, and I think that helped us to see this. And one thing about the literature is it's very Uber-centric or ride-hail-centric. And I think to understand platforms as entities, it really helps to look at a variety of platforms as we've done. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about 111 earners on 7 platforms. I've mentioned all of these platforms already. Relay Rides was renamed Turo. I showed you the Turo logo earlier. We did in-depth interviews with people and short surveys. We collected data from 2013 to 2016. We had started with a young group, 18 to 34, because when we started studying this sector, which was right at the very beginning, they were just about the only people on these platforms. So we confined it to that. And then for some comparability over time, we recruited in lots of different ways, sometimes through the platform, sometimes we went to orientations, sometimes snowballing. Everybody had to have a certain amount of training. And I can tell you more about the recruiting methods if you're interested. Okay. Key point, I've mentioned this already, how dependent the worker is on the platform for their livelihood, how much they rely on these earnings to pay their basic expenses differentiates their experiences. And we have 3 groups, the dependent workers, the partially dependent who have some reliance on the earnings, but they have other sources of income, and what we call supplemental earnings, which is, this is added onto their regular income source. So many of these are either full-time employees or full-time students. Dependent workers, for the delivery and ride-hail cases, we put the 2 platforms together, so if they could be dependent on both. That didn't make them a partially dependent, because so many workers use multiple apps at the same time. This
Julie,
is what we found in
in
terms of the breakdown, and this is fairly standard in terms of other studies.
Julie?
Yeah.
We have a question from Lindsay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on the dependency slide that was 1 or 2 back, as I'm thinking about Mary Graves' work in the 80-20 rule, and that have the majority of the people who do the work on the platform are only 80% of the work on the platform is done by 20% of the drivers. And that 20%, I sort of find in my research, tend to be wholly dependent on the work. So I'm curious about how do you think about the fact that you might have these different groups of people at different levels of platform dependency, but really the majority of the work is done by people in the dependent group?
So that varies a lot across platform. 80-20 is an exaggeration. I just happened to, we were talking about this in our group the other day, and I just happened to go to one of the latest Uber studies and found that it was more like about 56%, I think, for that concentrated group. So yes, that's absolutely true that you have a higher, you've got that concentration of work in those full-timers, which of course you would expect because they're putting more hours in. The sort of, I think the extent to which those people, the fraction of the work that they're doing varies across platform, number 1. And number 2, at the time we were doing this work, I think the work was less concentrated. Because our data collection ended in 2016. So, and I think it's more pronounced, a lot more pronounced in ride-hail than it is in some of these other on some of these other platforms. So that's how I would answer that question. Okay, so yeah. By the way, our findings here where we have about 40% supplemental, 32% partially dependent, about 25% dependent. I mean, it's due to our case selection, of course. It depends on, the platforms that you include will really make this matter. But one of the things that's seems pretty consistent across the large scale surveys is that that dependent fraction tends to be 30% or less. You don't find, ride hail is the exception now in some of the big cities. And I also think that, the platforms are changing in terms of the concentration of work in a smaller group, a kind of professionalization.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of Mary Gray's work on click work, the ghost work here, because that's where she invokes the 80-20 rule. But I know that wasn't one of the platforms you're looking at. It's all online, so it's a bit different.
I don't remember her numbers exactly on that. It's possible she actually had numbers, but I think my sense is when people say 80-20, they're exaggerating. But I'll have to go back and look. Yeah. It's a great question. Okay, so, all right, so let me just tell you what we found in terms of the worker experiences. And so we were asking people about things like their wages, the experience of the work, the riskiness of the work, the level of autonomy they had, and their sense of precarity and so forth. So the basic finding is that if you are a supplemental worker, a supplemental earner, you have good wages, you have non-pecuniary benefits, you can avoid problematic situations, and you have a fair amount of flexibility and autonomy. So TaskRabbits, for example, those who are supplemental earners, which were the majority of our interviewees, some of them they had good wages, so $25 an hour would be about the bottom. And many of these people had no specialized skills, so they're getting a lot more than you can earn in a lot of other low wage work. Up to people who were talking about getting, they would only accept certain jobs at $150 an hour and so forth. They talked about things like alleviating boredom, how much they enjoyed meeting people, the ability to create kind of a safety net among the people that they met. Some of them created little subcontracting businesses. Some of them created businesses which they then took off the platform, but social benefits, boredom, etc. They would never do things that they had any questions about, whether it was jobs that seemed scammy, jobs that felt a little bit of risky and so forth. So they were able to retain flexibility and autonomy. They used the earnings to reduce their financial precarity. So rather than gigs being a road to precarity for these people, they were actually a hedge against precarity. And of course, some of them managed a whole portfolio of earnings. And for some, it was a really good alternative to sort of low-end exploitative work, like working for a caterer and so forth. And one of the things, of course, that they loved about it was not having a boss, something you hear across the whole gig economy. On the other hand, the dependent earners had a different experience. They were still able to get high wages, but there wasn't enough work for them to get high incomes, annual incomes. So they were all earning poverty level wages, but $20,000 or less per year. They lost flexibility because they felt they pretty much had to take whatever jobs they can get, particularly after 2014, when the platform had a pivot and wages went up. There really wasn't enough demand. So that led people to take more jobs that they had questions about. They took slightly more risky tasks. And over time, on this platform as well as others, there's a kind of downward trajectory in terms of how lucrative the platform is and the experience. And a big part of that is over time, more and more earners went on to these open access platforms. And that, of course, led to more competition for the job, so less work. And in some cases, like ride hail or delivery, the platforms themselves were reducing the earnings. Postmates and Favor, our courier groups, The supplemental earners thought it was a great way to earn money. They loved getting exercise at the same time that they were earning money. They were able to avoid unsafe conditions, and they felt they had a lot of autonomy. So let me give you an example of the ways to think specifically about control issues, the ways in which being a supplemental earner allowed you to avoid algorithmic control. So the supplemental earners would tell us things like, if I drive at night, I'll never get out of the car. I will make the customer come down and get the food, for example. Completely counter to what the service is supposed to be. They would say, well, I never use the bags. I don't use the stickers. I put in a different, if I'm in my car, I still tell the algorithm that I'm on a bike, so I don't have to take any big packages. So they had, and Lindsay has done a lot of work on this, kind of the ways in which the earners are able to kind of trick the algorithm or avoid algorithmic control and so forth. And this is one of the things about the algorithmic control story, which is that it overstates the extent to which the algorithms can actually control the workers. But a key point here is that for both the TaskRabbits and the couriers, and it's also true for the drivers to a certain extent as well, being a supplemental earner meant that you don't have to submit to the authority of the algorithm nearly so much. As one earner said to us, we said, well, what if you would have to go back, what if your rating fell so much and you'd have to go back and redo the orientation? And it was like, oh, I would just quit then, because they're not going to allow themselves to be subjected to that much control. And this is something, that really we heard across the platforms. I should say I didn't include the Turo and the Airbnb because we didn't have any dependent workers on those platforms. So, yeah. Okay, but what about the dependent couriers? So for them, it was often a job of last resort. We had someone, for example, who'd been an Uber driver, but his car got too old. There were the lowest earnings on this platform. It's sort of the bottom of the platform hierarchy. The demand, of course, is very erratic through the day. I mean, there's a sort of lunchtime crush, there's a dinner crush. The full-time workers are much more vulnerable to weather. They're much more prone to accident, more vulnerable to traffic and so forth. They take more risks. And we also found a real wage autonomy trade-off here. So some of these platforms will give a wage guarantee if you sign up for the whole shift, and then you have to take whatever jobs they give. So you generally would tend to earn, you wouldn't be able to earn as much as if you were on the app at a good time, for example, but you would also have a floor. And what they most love to do was sign up for a shift on one app, get that guaranteed, and then add another app in and do what's called stacking, which was take multiple orders at the same time. But basically, same story here as with the TaskRabbits, which is, big differences in the dependent and supplemental earners. You know a lot more about Uber and Lyft. I'll just say that for the supplemental earners, the earnings were good. They loved the flexibility. It allowed them to use their spare time productively. They would often reduce costs associated with work. Like if they were commuting to their job, they'd put on the app and somebody else would pay for the toll to get into the city. It would, they would earn and so forth. And they pretty much all had good things to say, although we had far fewer supplemental earners among our Uber and Lyft drivers, in part for the reason that Lindsay said, because we recruited them through the app. So most of the people we got were more dependent. The dependent earners, on the other hand, no longer had control of their schedules. They had to work long hours because the wages were low. Constant changes in the way the app worked, a source of jeopardy and precarity, a lot of worry about ratings deactivation, which we didn't see as much on the other platforms, taking on debt to finance vehicles, and the big earnings squeeze that you've probably read a lot of in the newspapers. Okay, so that's what we found in terms of that issue of dependency. And I'm happy to go into more detail on any of this. I want to just show this one more slide to talk about another finding that we have. And here I'm showing 3 different platforms: Airbnb, TaskRabbit, and Stocksy, which was our platform co-op. We're seeing a little bit of this also with the couriers and the drivers, although we haven't coded all of those interviews. I would say there's less of this there, but there's still some. So we call this homo varians, which is variable. Homos meaning from homo economicus, economic man. And what we found is there are 3 kinds of models of economic behavior on the platforms. There's homo economicus, which I assume almost all of you have done some economics, so that's like rational agents, maximizing, optimizing. Those are people with spreadsheets. They're calculating exactly what they're earning. They're trying to figure out ways to earn more. They're entrepreneurial. They do things with a calculative maximizing orientation, and they're really concerned about the money. The second group, which we call homo instrumentalis, which if you have done economics, you would think of it in terms of people who have a target income. So they want the money. They're not calculating that much. They're not figuring out so much about how to set their prices. The homo economicus are doing market analyses. They're experimenting with prices. They're really trying to maximize their earnings. Homo instrumentalis just needs some money, and they're just, they're kind of following simple rules, heuristics. They're a little bit like Herb Simon's satisficers or bounded rational. A little bit behavioral econs, where they would have, show some of these non-rational characteristics. And then the third group we call homo socialis, who are people, it's not that they're not rational, but they have very strong social factors which are driving their behavior. So it might be that they want sociability. So on Airbnb, you have a lot of those. And that's a big part. I mean, everybody who's earning wants to earn. I mean, they're there to earn. So it's not that they don't care about money, but they care about other things. So they may be really wanting to socialize, but it's not only that kind of social behavior. We have people who won't charge very much on Airbnb because it feels unethical to them. One of them said, I don't want to charge more than the landlord can get. So they're leaving lots of money on the table. People who won't do things because they consider it a status insult. So tasks that they feel are beneath them. We had one TaskRabbit who talked a lot about the things she wouldn't do. Like she wouldn't get someone a latte because they should get their own latte. It's lazy not to get your own latte. And so she'd give up getting tasks because she would be insulted at the idea that she should get someone else's latte. And then we had a couple of hybrid cases. So why is this even interesting? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But for us, as we think about the platform as a place that's hosting a lot of heterogeneity, it's not just in how dependent workers are, how many hours they work on the jobs, what their backgrounds are, but it's also the kind of earning strategies that they bring to the platform. And in this, platforms are really different than conventional employers who do much more to control the way people work, how they are oriented. So if you're on a sales team and you're an HS and you're leaving a lot of money on the table, you're going to have trouble in a conventional firm. But on a platform, the company is really so far has not been saying, hey, we're going to kick you off unless you earn more. Again, we can come back to that. I mentioned this platform hierarchy. It's just a quick point to say that a lot of the literature treats these platforms as if they're the same thing, like an undifferentiated thing. But the platform economy has replicated a lot of the hierarchy or inequality that you see in the conventional economy. And there's a racial hierarchy here. There is an income hierarchy here in terms of the incomes that they have pre-platform. There's an educational hierarchy here. There's a kind of status hierarchy, socioeconomic, and so forth. So let me just end by with a couple of things. So the key findings of our work is we argue it's a new kind of labor regime which allows much, much more heterogeneity across numerous dimensions. Technology is key, but other factors are also important. This can be a highly desirable economic form for workers because it can offer high levels of autonomy and freedom, but not for people who are dependent on these platforms to make a living, because they are not, they don't provide enough income for people to be able to sort of reap those benefits. You really have to have another income source to have that kind of a great experience. And for that reason, I would say that so far platforms have been free riding on conventional employers because you need some other income source to get that really positive experience. We can ask whether it's a viable model over the long term for employers. And that's a big question. In the new paper that we're writing, we're sort of looking at the ways in which platforms are trying to tweak things to get these earners to be more like Homo economici. And of course, just a last point, especially relevant today as the ride-hail companies are shutting down in California, employment status is likely to transform the whole model. So thank you. I'm gonna stop my screen sharing now, but of course we can go back to any slides if people want to.
So this is a great opportunity for us to ask Julie whatever questions we have and get some of her wisdom and knowledge on these topics. So the floor is open. If you have a question, you can just unmute yourself and ask.
So yeah, I'll jump in with one about the earner orientation. And I'm trying to think about how they might fit into a broader process. So are there certain things about people's prior work experience, career background that helps put them in one earner orientation versus the other? And then what are the outcomes of having these different orientations? Sort of my thought is thinking maybe the platform will have more or less control over someone. It'll be more or less likely to resist based on that. But just curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so those are great questions. I don't know that, so we can't really answer them at the moment. One reason is, we tried to collect financial information from these folks, but it was hard to get really accurate information. So, I mean, anecdotally, it certainly seems that the HEs earn more. And it's a little bit impressionistic. Some of them earn a lot, but we're not that confident in the numbers that people gave us that we really, have sort of broken them down. Certainly on the artists platform, we know they earn more because they also are people who invest. I mean, I didn't get into all the details. They invest a lot more in their photo shoots. So they end up earning a lot more. And it's a very skewed income revenue distribution, by the way, on the photography platform, even though it's a co-op, which is interesting. So we expect that they earn more, but okay, anecdotal. Differences. So it looks like there, among these three platforms, it looks like there's some differences in gender, for example. So women tend to be a little more on the Homo socialis. I also, when I first started noticing this and then started working on this, started to code these transcripts to figure out, okay, is this really a real thing? One of the things I kept thinking of, is it just that these Homo instrumentalis they're just not savvy, they're just kind of dumb in the sense of like not adjusting, not doing what you should to earn more and so forth. They're just kind of going into it with a kind of dumb strategy, meaning not adjusting and so forth. And there's a little bit of that, I think. Some of them are just they're just a little bit clueless. But on the other hand, eventually it became clear that it's more than that. They're also just, they don't take opportunities. They sort of stick with something else. And they may just not want to have that like highly calculative orientation. This does bring up one other thing that I think is really important about these platforms. And Lindsay, you may have heard me say this before, but it's one of the things that I would love to see more work done on. But if you think about a conventional workplace where for any given job, the employer sets the wages, and although there may be some incentive pay and so forth, there's a lot smaller range in terms of what people earn because it's institutionalized, and especially if there are unions or other forces that sort of set those wages. The platform economy, Lindsay, as I'm sure you well know, in the platform economy, your ability to master, no, we're not using that word, your ability to learn the app and to get the most out of it and to maximize the earnings and so forth also depends a lot on what the individual brings to the platform. So we would expect a lot more variation in earnings, which are based on things which are external to the platform. So based on things that are more intrinsic to the earner. Now, there are all these worker forums now. We've actually been studying them where people are sharing tips. And so that's going to mitigate that to a certain extent. But it's also true that because the apps are constantly changing, the people who are able to understand those changes, adjust to them, change their strategies and so forth more quickly, are going to do better. And so everybody else may be sort of catching up and they may never get all the way there to what, some of the highest earners earn. So that's another dimension of variation that I think is really important. Just the last, I know this is a long-winded answer. The last thing I'll say on this, and this has to do with one of my frustrations about the literature, which is I feel like a lot of the literature, because it just focused on those full-time earners or those dependent earners and their experiences, has really downplayed the heterogeneity. And if you think about platforms and the open access dimensions of platforms, you really have to think heterogeneity is probably going to be something really, really important in terms of how these things operate.
Juliet, thanks for your insightful presentation. I have a question. You offered two good ways to think about heterogeneity, one about the dependence and one about how much they're focused on profit motives versus other social motives. Are these highly correlated in the sense that, is it the case that the dependent workers are mostly the homo economics, whereas the non-dependent people, the supplemental earners, can afford to be the homo socialis? Or do you not find necessarily that strong a correlation? I'm curious.
It's not that strong. Couple of things. One is we find a lot of pretty well-off people, particularly on the capital platforms. I didn't include we have a small sample of those, the Turo, the ones who rent out their cars. But the thing about a lot of those homo economici is that they're well-off people who just like making a buck or are just very money oriented. So they're somebody who has a condo, they start renting it out. Wow, I can get $300, $400 a night for this. Now I'm going to buy another condo and I'm going to outfit it. Or there's a great story we heard early on, and then it was in the newspapers in Chicago, of a guy who lived in a neighborhood and he got 34 cars to rent out on Turo. And then the neighbors went crazy because he was parking them all over the place. So they're just these really entrepreneurial people. and most of them have money, a fair amount of money. So they're able, as one said, it takes money to make money. And they're that kind of person. Some of the dependent earners are really HIs because they're very, they're just not that savvy about the way they're doing things. They just need the money. I think it's true that the HSs tend to be less, a little bit less desperate economically. They can't afford to give up too much money.
Thank you.
I have a question, Julie. So this is sort of a big picture, vague question. I mean, it used to be called the sharing economy. And I mean, at least my idea of sharing was that, oh, I have something and I can share it so other people can use it. And maybe they have something and they will share it and I will use it. And you call it, I think, rightly the gig economy because it's a lot about just labor. So it becomes like you're employing, paying people for their time. And maybe there is some aspect of sharing on some parts of Airbnb and some parts of Turo, while other people have just made it their business and then they invest in properties or cars. So in some sense it feels a little bit sad to me that it's not a sharing economy the way I had pictured it when I first heard the term maybe a decade back. And so, what are your thoughts on that? And is there any hope for that kind of vision to be realized in any substantial form?
Yeah, well, I've written a bunch about this. So the term sharing economy came in 2012. So that slide at the beginning where I said my project used to be called Connected Economy and Connected Consumption. At that time, this stuff was being called collaborative consumption. The core idea of collaborative consumption was the sharing of assets. So idle assets that people then either gave or rented out to others. So it was the spare room in your house, Airbnb. I mean, ride hail originally was called ride share because the idea was that people would give seats in their car when they were going somewhere anyway. So when sharing economy, well, the companies loved it because of the wholesome, the halo of sharing. Who doesn't love sharing? But one key thing about that, the situation in 2012, and I talk a lot about this in my book, is it was made up of a combination of these for-profit platforms and nonprofits, and they had a community together, and they were in a common discourse, and there was this idea that somehow there wasn't that much difference in them. Now, and the Lyft, TaskRabbit, Airbnb, they all used what I called an idealist discourse to sort of keep, kind of say, oh, we're all in this sharing thing. And we believe in all these wonderful things that are going to happen because of this kind of new kind of activity that we're doing. Uber, by the way, never considered itself a sharing economy company, and it never used that idealist discourse, although it was always lumped together in the press. And of course, why would Lyft be and Uber not when they're basically the same company, except, one had the pink mustache. So over time, but, some people, and I have one paper where we talk about this, would say sharing economy is really just that asset sharing, whether it's for money or not, because if you have a paying guest in your home on Airbnb, there's still a sense in which you can say you're sharing your home, even if you're getting money from it. But very different than the commercialized version, which you're just renting out a whole apartment. So yes, commercialization, which is that process of that's happened on the for-profit platforms, certainly has taken us away from sharing. And in my book, the last chapter is really about, can we reclaim the sharing economy and how could we do that and so forth. And what I would say is one of the most important ways we could think about kind of getting back to a concept of sharing is sharing the ownership of the platforms. So moving from that concentrated private ownership model in which the platforms, owned by a small number of extraordinarily wealthy people and getting more and more powerful by the day, where they determine these conditions for all of these people who are trying to earn on them, and get back to like an idea of a sort of mutually governed, and ideally owned. And there's a whole movement called platform cooperativism, centered at the New School in New York, which is really trying to seed these platform co-ops. And, you know, I can go into why I think they're economically a really great idea and why they should have some legs.
That's fascinating. Thank you. I mean, I think just adding to that, people. I think that there is this gap in terms of there is a big technology wedge that these big private companies have, and the cooperatives would be great if they can even get to within 10% of where the big ones are.
Yeah.
So if somehow that gap can be that chasm can be made like smaller with, I don't know how, but I have some ideas, but if that can be made smaller, maybe it's possible.
Yeah. The basic technology now is pretty replicable. I mean, when these 2008-9, when these Airbnb, Uber, et cetera, came in, you know, they had a really big edge in technology. So platform co-ops can get a lot of the basics of the technology at this point. They're not necessarily going to be able to get to the next wave. And I think, you know, it's not trivial for them to keep up with the technology, but a lot of what the platforms are currently doing can be, excuse me, can be replicated, I think, by smaller co-ops.
I see.
I have a question actually, Julie. So have you looked at any platform that's primarily serving businesses on the demand side versus consumers?
Yeah,
And
so
what are differences over there?
all of the platforms that we did, except for one, are consumer oriented, because we were looking at interested in those consumption, you know, services. But the platform co-op is not. That's a you know, B2B platform, because those, I mean, I suppose you can buy as an individual, but for the most part, it's businesses. Yeah, I mean, do you have particular questions about that? Or, I mean, I can tell you more about how it's different from others. It's also different because it's worker owned and governed, but.
I think the question was like, yeah, how does these insights differ across B2B platform versus like B2C?
So I think, you know, one of the really big questions is the open access and whether the B2Bs allow as much open access. Because things start to change once you eliminate that feature of the platform. And so the photography platform that we studied is not an open access. In fact, it's extremely competitive to get into it. I like to say that, you know, with its initial membership, it was harder to get into the platform than it is to get into Harvard College. So it gives you a sense of, like, you know, it was something like it was a 4% or something acceptance rate. And they're only increasing very slowly. It's been a phenomenally successful platform. It's, you know, it has a niche position. It, you know, everything has just basically been going really well for it. And it's been challenging Getty, which is like the, you know, the Google of, stock photography. And in fact, Getty has started to adjust its own strategy to compete with this small upstart.
I see.
So that's a really big question, I think. And it's really key to understanding platform dynamics, how much open access, you know, just like any common resource. If you think of Elinor Ostrom's work on ecosystems, the difference between an open access commons and a restricted access commons is all the difference in the world. And that's really key. And I think most of the platform co-ops, it's, unless you have, when the true co-ops, I think are going to, not many of them as they develop are going to have open access, because with restricted demand and open access, you never get enough work for people.
I have a question if I can ask real quick. Did you notice in your in your studies, did you notice any differences in the heterogeneity of the participants in the marketplace, depending on whether the asset was someone's time or some hard asset that they had? So for example, Airbnb, you may have an extra room, you have a 2-bedroom apartment, and you're never going to use that other bedroom. And so that's an asset that's not really doing anything. Maybe for the car sharing platform, I can't remember the name of the platform, but you have an extra car and 9 to 5 during the day, it's not doing anything, versus I have to go sit on an app and wait for someone to order a cheeseburger or wait for someone to need a ride. Did you notice any discrepancy in the type of the participants across those two platforms?
Do you mean like their demographic?
In terms of why they were there, in terms of their their earner orientation, or in terms of the amount of income that they derived based on being on that platform?
Yeah. Oh, well, for sure the last. I mean, Airbnb, if you have an asset to sell, it's much more lucrative. So the Airbnb earners got so much more money than everyone else. The car rental platform doesn't earn that much for people. The rates are really not that high and the demand is not that great. TaskRabbit, so I would say no in one sense, which is that the supplemental earners on TaskRabbit, and especially those who had a nice skill, or even if they didn't have a great skill, they might have built up a really good profile on the app so that they're able to command high wages. For those people, they're not going to have to sit around and wait on the app the way the dependent earners are. So the dependent earners are generally earning less. One guy really stays in mind. He was a supplemental TaskRabbit, and he said he hated waiting on lines for iPhones, but that's a big, when a new iPhone came out, that was like a big task that would be on the platform. And he'd charge $150 an hour to wait. And people would hire him because he had such a great reputation and ratings and all of that. So I would say it wasn't just a capital labor difference. A lot of people in the field, like there's, in the literature, they're the capital platforms and the labor platforms. And while that's fair, it's also important to remember that all activity takes some labor and some capital. And so it's not a huge divergence between the two, I think. You have to think of it more as a continuum. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay,
I've got to jump off now for a faculty meeting, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining, Lindsay.
Thank you, Lindsay. Great questions as always. Great to see you.
And let's take the opportunity to thank Julie as well and declare the official part of this close. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.